The night was cool and restless. Torches hissed in the wind, and chains of bonfires stretched across the valley beneath the city walls. Queen Isabella looked at the dark towers and thought about the long years of travel that had brought her to this shore. She knew that much could change before dawn, but her decision was already made. The book of the 100 Years' War must be closed. I am happy to welcome everyone who is listening to this story. Tell me where you are watching this video from and write about it in the comments. I wish you pleasant listening and calm attention to the details that come together to form a complete picture. The camp stretched out in a smooth arc. The knight's tent stood closer to the banners. Further away were the tents of the servants and carters. Clothes were drying by the fires, broth was boiling, knives were being sharpened. At night, coughs, the whispers of guards, and the occasional barking of dogs could be heard. At dawn, a scribe named Hernando awoke. His tent was modest, but inside it lay a box of parchments and a narrow leather purse where he carefully kept a medallion, a thin disc with a scratched pattern in the shape of half a moon. He was told it was a trinket, but he often noticed old men lingering over it and then changing the subject. Captain Diego de Castro arrived at the camp. He despised people without titles and believed that negotiations wasted time and took away from glory. He handed Hernando a bundle and said through an intermediary that the queen needed a clear translation of the letters from the city. The bundle turned out to be bulky. It contained notes in Arabic, seals, lists of grain and weapons, and an unsigned letter. Hernando sat down, spread out the papers, and felt his hand tremble. The letter repeated a name he knew only from his dead mother's whispers. The name was simple and rare, and next to it was a crescent moon symbol, similar to the pattern on his medallion. He translated the letters by noon and took them to the treasurer. The treasurer told him to wait. That day, a caravan of craftsmen and merchants approached the camp and was allowed through the barriers after inspection. Among them was a woman in a simple veil. She was carrying a basket of jugs and asked to be allowed to see the cooks. She was allowed in because the clay pots in the camp were always breaking and everyone needed jugs. Hernando noticed her looking at his medallion and felt that her gaze was not accidental. The woman told the guide that the pattern resembled the sign of a family from the pottery district. The guide repeated this in rough Castilian, and Hernando asked him to leave the woman near the kitchen. He thought it would be calmer that way, but he already understood that what he had long avoided was beginning. In the evening, the queen sent for him. She asked what the city's response was. Hernando summarized. They were arguing, waiting, bargaining, and afraid. Some of the soldiers wanted to hold out to the last, while others asked for the gates to be opened for the sake of their families' lives. The queen instructed him to conduct delicate correspondence, in which every word acted like a peg in soft ground. She noted that the letters had different handwritings, which helped to understand the balance of power. Hernando nodded and took the scrolls away. On his way out, the treasurer called out to him. He reported that salaries had been delayed and irritation was growing, which meant that any provocation could disrupt the plan. The treasurer said he had heard about the boxes of gifts that were often brought at such times and ordered that no one else's chests be accepted without inspection. At night, a chest was brought to the camp. It was delivered by a short man in a worn cloak. He claimed that he was carrying a handmade carpet for the queen and referred to a letter supposedly signed by the city councilor. The chest was placed under a canopy and locked. The guard on duty noted the time and smiled. He considered it a normal part of the bargaining process. However, by morning, a tart sour smell was coming from the chest. The inspectors removed the lid. Inside was a carpet, and underneath it were bundles and a flat vessel containing a thick liquid. The vessel had a clay stopper to which a thin tube was attached. The man in the cloak had already disappeared, and the guard turned pale. He remembered the treasurer's words and raised the alarm. The carpet was unfolded. There, they found a diagram of the siege camp, marked with charcoal, and in the corner, descriptions of people from the queen's retinue. The random chest turned into a silent threat. A short, domestic thriller began. Everyone knew that one wrong move would ruin a week of negotiations. Hernando was summoned. He examined the diagram and noticed tiny marks near the spring. He realized that someone was marking the route for a night raid. The treasurer ordered the chest to be removed and the carpet to be hidden. The vessel was carefully carried to the ditch and emptied when they realized that it contained rancid oil that would ignite from a spark. By evening, a rumor spread that there were traitors in the camp. Captain Diego was gloomy, assigned mounted guards, and assured everyone that it was time to end the negotiations with the sword. He looked at Hernando as if he were a spare man and repeated that his work was interfering with the cause. The next day, the woman with the jugs came to the kitchen again. Her name was Fatima. She asked for the broken shards to be given to her so she could mix a new batch of clay. Hernando approached and asked through the cook if she remembered the crescent moon symbol with 3 dots. The cook was surprised that a man in a simple cloak spoke clear Arabic. Fatima replied that the symbol belonged to her brother's workshop, who had disappeared many years ago on his way north with a young woman from a border village. Hernando took out the medallion. Fatima turned pale. She said through the cook that her brother had one just like it. Hernando's throat went dry. He realized that for many years he had been carrying half of his family tree on his chest. A hidden kinship was slowly coming to the surface. Fatima added that her brother had a habit of making a small mistake in the pattern and pointed it out on the medallion. This detail finally tied everything together. He returned to the tent and sat over the letters for a long time. In an old scroll, he found a note that a master with that name ruled the pottery district. The scroll was old, but it mentioned a daughter, born in the year when heavy snow fell in the north. Hernando remembered his mother's stories about the winter that broke the roofs. Now he saw how closely the personal and the political were intertwined. He was faced not only with the task of translation, but also with a choice: to acknowledge the connection and take a risk, or to pretend he had understood nothing. In the evening, the queen gathered a small circle of people. They discussed bread, water, guard duty schedules, the amount of obligations and mortgages. The treasurer opened his notebook and showed that it would be difficult to keep the hungry and tired soldiers at bay. Money had to be found urgently to pay part of the soldiers' wages. Suddenly, a man in a dark, neatly trimmed fur coat was allowed into the tent. His name was Lope de Segura. He was a wool merchant and had warehouses in large cities. People looked askance at him because of his origins and connections, which not everyone considered above board. Lope calmly offered to settle the debt with the nearest coins against future collections. The treasurer grimaced. Captain Diego smiled, but the queen looked at the list of numbers and said she would check the terms. Lope added that the money could be in the camp before dawn, as the wagon train was nearby. It sounded like a drum roll. He turned out to be an unexpected benefactor, and the tone of the entire following week depended on his decision. Day after day passed. Letters came from the city. One of the scribes on the other side described the shortage of grain and the disputes between the clans. Hernando replied with quiet formulas that allowed him to save face. Fatima brought jugs from time to time and found out the news. She said that there was a hidden gate in the city near the old irrigation ditch that her father had once built. This gate could provide the defenders with a way for night raids, but it could also allow people to leave the city in small groups if panic broke out. Hernando understood the value of this information. He did not run to the captain, but went to the treasurer, because he understood that bad news in the hands of a hot-headed person would bring disaster. The treasurer ordered silence and informed the queen. They decided to strengthen the guards at the irrigation ditch, but without any noisy rearrangements. Rumors about the chest did not subside. Soon, another item was brought to the shed, a long bale of cloth with words hidden in the patterns. Hernando saw them and realized that they were clues for those who were ready to break off negotiations. He carefully gathered the bale, set fire to the edge, and waited for the ashes to scatter. The next morning, someone left a basket of bread by the kitchen. The bakers were delighted, but one of the assistants noticed a strange smell. They checked the basket and found thin bubbles of flammable liquid under the bread. A trivial household item had once again turned into a threat. Rumors spread throughout the camp that someone was able to change their appearance and pass through the checkpoints unhindered. The guards began to record everyone who entered and left. Captain Diego demanded an assault. The Queen held the line on negotiations because she knew the price of blood. During those days, a guy named Martin came to the fore. He was a stable boy, carrying water and cleaning hooves. His job seemed insignificant, and jokers often sent him on errands to the distant ranks to laugh at his fatigue. But Martin ran a lot and knew the trails. When a letter needed to be delivered urgently to a neighboring detachment, and the reply brought back before sunset, everyone shrugged. Martin took a leather bag, tightened the straps, and disappeared into the thickets. He returned shortly thereafter, covered in dust, and handed over a receipt with 3 marks on it. His route turned out to be the shortest of all, because he knew where the fords were shallow and the bushes didn't snag clothing. This small detail saved the day, because the answer determined how to set up guards at the irrigation ditch. From that moment on, Martin was no longer considered an empty-headed boy. He became that underrated person who at the right moment holds an important knot on himself. The letters from the city became more nervous. The parties argued about keys, hostages, and the place where the spears would be laid down. Once, a note arrived without a seal. It said that a group of young, hot-headed warriors was preparing a daring sortie and that one of the people in the royal camp was helping them. The treasurer began to check the lists. A clerk from the auxiliary tent came under suspicion. His name was Esteban. He was found to have unusually clean boots, even though he had supposedly been carrying water all night. Esteban insisted that the laundress had washed them, but no one had seen the laundress at that time. He was removed from his duties. Captain Diego again insisted on brute force. The Queen said that clarity was needed, otherwise blood would drown the agreement. Hernando did not sleep that night. He listened to the footsteps of the guards and listened to the sound of water in the irrigation ditch. He thought about his mother, the medallion, and Fatima. It seemed to him that he was holding an invisible thread in his palm, and if he pulled it, the knot would tighten, and if he let go, everything would fall apart. Towards morning, he went to the irrigation ditch and saw Fatima with a net. She was collecting debris to dry the clay. Fatima said that the city was ready to accept the terms, but they were afraid that someone would disrupt the surrender for the sake of glory. She asked that in the first days after the surrender, women and children be allowed to leave in groups without being searched in a rough manner. Hernando promised to pass on the request, and this promise became a personal commitment for him. On the same day, a new knot appeared in the camp. Lope de Segura brought money. He laid the bags on the treasurer's table. Some of the officers dispersed with satisfaction. By evening, the camp ranks had quieted down, and the whispers about the chest had died down. Lope became a dangerously useful person. This did not please Captain Diego, who believed that merchants should not rule the war. Diego began to watch Lope. Meanwhile, Martin, who was entrusted with carrying short notes between the tents, brought Hernando a ribbon that had been accidentally dropped. There was a strange inscription on the ribbon. Hernando realized that these were code symbols, exchanged between Esteban's men and those who were waiting for the night raid. He showed it to the treasurer. Esteban was placed under guard in a distant tent. Before dawn, the city agreed. They wrote that they were ready to hand over the keys on condition that the lives and honor of those who laid down their arms would be spared. The queen replied briefly and clearly. She set the day and place. On that day, as expected, people lined up on the square by the stream. The banners were neatly leaned against their poles. The officers checked the seals. Fatima, hiding in the shadow of a cart, watched as the lines of life of her city and the enemy camp converged. Martin stood next to Hernando and waited for the signal. When the process began, a man ran out of the back row and rushed to the ditch. He tried to signal his people. Martin beat him to it. He caught up with the runner and knocked him down into the grass. The guards arrived and pulled his arms back. Martin stood over him and blinked, not understanding what would happen next. At that moment, fear swept through the rows, but the queen did not raise her voice. She simply gestured for them to continue. The keys were passed one by one, each one ringing softly like a nail on a stone. People counted the bundles and checked the marks. The sun rose slowly. The agreement was based on strict discipline and trust in the words written on parchment. When it was over, the queen ordered that the women and children who wanted to leave could pass through the camp to the valley. She ordered jugs of water to be placed along the road. Fatima stood nearby, and for the first time in many days did not clench her fingers. Hernando took off his medallion and showed it to her. She said she knew where there was an old half-moon sign on a wall in the city. They agreed to meet at the gate when it was safe. In the evening, when the camp was buzzing with quiet conversations, Lope approached Hernando's tent. He said he had heard about the medallion and the family connection. He offered his help, saying he could arrange for some of the craftsmen to return to neighboring towns if they agreed to new jobs. Hernando realized that this offer could save families. He thanked him and said he would pass on the message. At that hour, Captain Diego was writing his report and thinking about how to account for the lost glory of the assault. He wrote that his advice had been ignored and that the merchant Lope had interfered in the affairs of the army. Diego was going to write a complaint, but he understood that the outcome of the negotiations spoke for itself. The next day, craftsmen from the city came to the camp. They carried tools and asked for a receipt, stating that they would not be touched. Hernando wrote short notes about protection. He certified each one with his seal, and Martin helped distribute them. Fatima brought 2 boys and an old man. The old man saw Hernando's medallion and said he remembered a young man who wore the same one many years ago and went north with a girl. Hernando held his breath. The old man described the house on the corner of the stovemaker's street, where the sign of a half-moon was still visible on the cornice. Fatima agreed to show him the place when the guards allowed it. The commissars entered the city, and a difficult but necessary inventory of grain, barns, and tools began. People spoke quietly, because loud words could hurt. At that moment, someone tried to take a chest of coins out of the city. He was stopped at the gate by the irrigation ditch. There were thin tubes with thick liquid again, and the guards realized that the fiery idea was not dead yet. The queen ordered the gate to be blocked with a stone. Fatima stood nearby and nodded. She said that otherwise there would be new outbreaks. Hernando wrote down the order and thought about how one small detail could save many lives. The first few days were difficult, but bloodless. Martin began to ride with the commissioners and help at the crossings. He was known by name, although until recently he had been completely unnoticed. Lope de Segura left for the south to open warehouses and transfer workers. Captain Diego sent his letter. Hernando took a day off and entered the city with Fatima. They walked to the pottery district, where the air smelled of clay and water. On the corner of an old stone house was a sign of a half-moon. Fatima said it was their home. Hernando touched the stone and felt a long circle closing. The morning of the second day was clear and quiet. The city breathed with an unusual silence, in which you could hear doors creaking and water dripping from the eaves. Hernando and Fatima climbed onto a flat roof and looked out over the valley. In the camp, they were pulling down the extra tents tied with ropes. Soldiers were clearing away the fires so as not to leave any traces. The Queen appointed new administrators to maintain order after the troops left. She understood that the main work would begin not on the day the keys were handed over, but afterwards, when it would be necessary to keep people from seeking revenge and falling into emptiness. On that day, news came to the city that Esteban, who had been kept under guard, had disappeared. He had disappeared during the night from the tent where the recruit was on duty. Martin remembered that the recruit had asked him for a rope to repair his harness, and he had given him a thin belt. Now the belt was gone. The treasurer frowned, and Captain Diego demanded a search of the nearest houses. The Queen said that the neighborhoods should not be burdened with sudden raids. She ordered the paths to the irrigation ditch to be blocked and calm, attentive people to be posted at the junctions. Martin asked permission to comb the thickets himself, because he knew every bush. He was given 2 riflemen. They found tracks near the old water ladder and a piece of torn ribbon, the same as the one Esteban had. The trail was lost at an abandoned bathhouse. While they were searching for Esteban, a package was delivered to Fatima's house. It was left on the doorstep, and the delivery person left. Fatima called Hernando. He carefully untied the knot and saw a ceramic tile inside with the same half-moon symbol, but next to it was a small engraving in the form of a dot extending beyond the edge. This detail was known only to those who worked in her father's workshop. The package also contained a piece of parchment with a short phrase. It said that one person from their clan was still alive and waiting by the north wall, where the shadow fell on the broken stone. Hernando realized that this could be a trap, but also a chance to tie up loose ends. They did not go alone, but with an elderly neighbor who knew the secret places where dishes were dried. There, they found an old man in a worn cloak. He said that he had once saved a young man who was being pursued and gave him half of the medallion. He said that he knew Hernando's mother and helped her flee to the northern lands. This is how the hidden kinship that Fatima had hinted at came to be. The old man showed a mark on his hand that only the family could know about. Hernando did not hug him or fall to his knees. He just nodded, because he understood the value of such a meeting in a city where every glance now carries weight. By evening, rumors had spread throughout the city about a new attempt to smuggle money through the irrigation ditch. The guards caught 3 people. One of them reported with trembling lips that Esteban was leading a small group that was waiting for a spark. That spark could become a fire that would burn everything they had achieved in a week. Captain Diego was preparing his men, but the Queen did not want a noisy raid. She said through the treasurer that a quiet approach was needed. Otherwise, every courtyard would turn into a firing point. Hernando remembered the carpet with the passage program in the chest. He suggested using the same form of signs to lure Esteban into the open. The treasurer agreed. Martin distributed notes to the places where Esteban's assistants liked to gather. The notes said that the decisive meeting was scheduled at an abandoned bathhouse and that there would be a horse and money there. The word money was bait that usually worked in a hurry. At dusk, a man in a hood approached the bathhouse. Martin lay in the bushes and saw him peeking through the cracks. The man took a step toward the door, and then the archers came out of the shadows. It was Esteban. He had not been beaten. He was brought to the treasurer and given a letter stating that the keys would be handed over and the inhabitants would be protected if they laid down their arms. Esteban read it and remained silent. In the end, he said he did not believe in the agreement because someone like him always remained in between. Captain Diego wanted him punished, but the Queen ordered him to be handed over to the city guard so that they could judge him according to the rules accepted for their own people. This became a difficult but important sign. The agreement holds if both sides are responsible for their people. Meanwhile, a long line had formed at the gate. Women and children came out in groups, and jugs of water stood by the road. Martin and 2 other men made sure that no one pushed and that the elderly were allowed to pass. Some men walked alongside carrying bundles. The Queen had ordered that no one touch their clothes and that the way be kept clear. Fatima led a familiar widow with 2 girls across the line. She had returned to the city because her ovens were waiting for her, and a city without ovens dies. A few days later, the first work began in the city. Craftsmen repaired irrigation ditches, raised the canal, and cleaned wells. Lope returned with his people and brought sacks of wool. He offered work to those who were willing to move to new settlements and build workshops. His words were met with distrust, but he did not argue. He simply paid in advance and left short receipts. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Captain Diego still believed that the merchant was playing games and complained about him at every opportunity. However, the treasurer saw that the camp was calmer when there was work and bread. One day, Fatima asked Hernando to come to the old house by the wall. There was a hiding place with molds for ceramics, and she wanted to see if they could be taken to the workshop outside the city. They lifted the stove and found not only the molds, but also a book wrapped in cloth. The book was in 2 languages. It was a reference book of patterns and measurements, compiled by her father in the years when he still traded with the North. In the middle was a sheet with half a pattern that matched Hernando's medallion exactly. It was not a treasure that made your head spin. It was the simple work of life that connected the city and the North. Hernando realized that this sheet could become a bridge, because craftsmanship can connect where words fall short. He suggested holding an exhibition of patterns at the gate to show people that the connections had always been there. Fatima agreed and said she knew how to arrange the tables carefully so that no one would slip and break anything. The exhibition took place on a quiet day. People came up, looked at the patterns, and compared them with jugs and plates. Some brought their own work and compared it. Soldiers also came. They stood aside and silently watched as the pattern repeated itself on different objects. Martin brought a bucket of water and watered the dusty road so that it would not rise in a cloud. Captain Diego approached the tables and looked at one sign for a long time. The treasurer noted that for the first time in many days, people were standing side by side without angry words. The Queen passed by and quietly noted that this was right. After the war, people learned to look at work, not fear. But peace is fragile when old debts lurk beneath it. That same evening, news came that a bundle of arrows and tar pots had been found in a house on the outskirts. The owner of the house insisted that they had been left behind by the previous owners. During the night, the house caught fire. The neighbors screamed, water splashed in troughs. Martin and the archers pulled out the children, while Fatima carried out the uniforms so that the fire would not consume the workshop. The house was extinguished. In the morning, people came forward who said they had seen a shadow. Captain Diego again demanded a raid. The Queen said that those who held the bundles of arrows needed to be pressured. She appointed an official who could make quick decisions on the spot. That person was Hernando. His quiet ability to bring people together proved more useful than loud orders. It was a turning point where a man without a title gained the right to decide because he had proven his skill through his actions. Hernando began with simple steps. He set up a table near the gate, laid out parchments, and called those who knew how to count. Everyone who brought arrows and pots to light received receipts and protection from search. People took old dangerous things out of their hiding places and handed them over because they saw that they were not being humiliated. The treasurer kept records. Captain Diego gritted his teeth, but he could not disrupt the order. Lope brought nails and boards so that people could repair doors and windows. Fatima arranged for jugs and loaves of bread to be delivered, so that there would always be water and food on the table. Martin ran between the rows, bringing paper and ink. The soldiers looked at him with respect. He became the very person who held the fabric of everyday life together, and no one laughed at his running around anymore. During those same days, Esteban was found. He had tried to escape via a distant ford, but he was recognized. He was brought before the city elders. Hernando suggested that the trial be open. People gathered in the square. No one shouted. The elders read out his case and questioned the witnesses. Esteban said he did what he did because he was afraid that tomorrow he would be expelled from the camp and left destitute. He admitted that he had added fuel to someone else's fire. He was sentenced and taken into custody. It was a sobering, difficult moment that gave people a bitter but understandable picture of justice. A week later, the city sounded different. You could hear hammers pounding, horses pulling logs, and children running for water. The queen was preparing to leave. She looked over the new lists and ordered a small guard to be left at the irrigation ditch and the gates. She thanked those who had kept order. Captain Diego received a dry report stating that he had conscientiously carried out his patrols. Lope received a letter confirming the legality of his warehouses. The treasurer noted that the salary had been partially paid. Hernando received a short note stating that he was appointed as the representative for communication with the craftsmen. Fatima found a new wheel in the workshop that could be used to sharpen jugs and said that this wheel would last longer than any dispute. Martin received a horse with a simple saddle and a letter addressed to the carrier. He smiled and said he would keep the road clear. Just before departure, the queen ordered another quiet ceremony. Old keys were placed in a chest in the square, and new ones were placed next to them. This symbolized the transition that had taken place before the eyes of the people. Fatima brought a jug of water and placed it between the chests. She said that water flows if there is a gutter, and repeated her father's words that labor loves order. The treasurer noted that this phrase was worth more than long decrees. People silently looked at the jug and the keys. Captain Diego stood in the shade and understood that the war had ended not with the beat of a drum, but with the hard work of many hands. Lope counted the lists and was already planning routes for the wagons in his mind. Hernando looked at the stone with half a moon and thought of his mother. The old man who had once saved her sat nearby, warming his hands in the sun. Martin checked the girths and smiled at the boys who were touching the horse's mane. When the army moved north, the city did not fall silent. It remained alive. On the roof of the house where the half-moon sign had been carved, Fatima hung the first new jugs. They were simple in shape, without unnecessary patterns. She said that strength should come first, and beauty would follow. Hernando sat by the window, rewriting the list of craftsmen who needed clay. He wrote that the first cart should be sent to the valley, where the water was cleaner. He knew that this list was more important than loud words, because it fed people. Martin led the horse to the ford and checked to see if the bank had been washed away. He nodded to the boy who brought him the harness. A little time passed, and a carpet arrived at the market. 2 boys brought it and said they had found it in an abandoned house. The carpet was similar to the one that lay in the chest with the fiery lure, but this one had no traces of charcoal on it. Hernando found more hidden symbols in the pattern. He realized that the carpet was a chain leading to those who still hoped to bring back the night. He ordered everyone to keep quiet. He quietly called the craftsmen, who knew how to read patterns, and they showed that the symbols led to an old storeroom outside the city walls. There, they found another cache of arrows. They opened it in front of everyone and handed it over to the treasury. The people saw that the authorities were not playing guessing games, but were working. This strengthened their trust more than any speech could have done. After a while, Lope sent word that jugs and bowls were needed in neighboring towns. Fatima chose 2 students and sent them with Martin. Martin taught them how to choose fords so that the carts would not get stuck. On the way, they met people who had heard about the surrender of the keys. Some expected trouble, others believed in order. Martin explained in simple terms how there were jugs of water at the gates and how people walked without shouting. He did not mention any famous names. He spoke of the road that must be kept clear. When he returned, he brought a letter from the old master, who asked for the patterns and descriptions to be sent. Hernando enclosed a copy of a page from Father Fatima's book in his reply. He wrote that the patterns could be repeated, but it was important to remember the measurements, otherwise the bowls would crack. He added a small note about the half-moon, as a reminder that the different banks of the river sometimes come together in one sign. It was personal, but there was no secret to hide. Fatima smiled when she read the copy. She said that now their sign would live on in simple things, and that was better than any coat of arms. Soon, another knot arose. Captain Diego received a response to his complaint. He was offered a choice: transfer to another unit or stay in the city and work on fortifications. He chose to stay. He began patrolling the walls, checking the ladders and warehouses. He rarely spoke to Lope, but he no longer argued with him in front of everyone. They exchanged short notes that contained no insults. It was dry and proper. The treasurer recorded that expenses were going according to plan. Martin noted the depth of the fords after rain in the list. Hernando drew up a simple rule for resolving disputes. Everyone listens to the other person until the end, then says what they have understood, and then they look for a solution. This rule quickly took root because it eliminated shouting. One day, a man in a cloak came to the square. He told a boy that he wanted to see the person wearing the medallion with half a moon. Hernando came out. The man handed him a small bag. Inside was the other half. The man said that his father had once kept it for his master, but had not dared to give it away. Now the time had come. Hernando put the halves together, and they matched. Fatima said that their home was now whole again. The old man in the square nodded and closed his eyes. The people around did not understand anything, but they felt that a long thread had come to an end. By the end of the season, the city had changed. There were no more hiding places with arrows, and children stopped finding iron in the bushes. There were notices on the gates saying when and where to hand in old things. There were stones by the irrigation ditch, and the water flowed smoothly. Fatima opened a second oven. Martin took his students to the fords and taught them to look at the shore, not the sky. Lope expanded the warehouses. Captain Diego began building a new staircase to the wall. The treasurer cleaned the books. Hernando made short notes in his notebooks, where every word was chosen, not for beauty, but for practicality. One evening, Fatima placed a jug and a plate on the table. She said that her father had come up with the pattern while thinking about the road. The plate had a wavy line and a small crescent moon next to it. Hernando said that this plate should go to the house of the one who watches over the fords. Martin was embarrassed, but he took it. He put the plate on the shelf and said he would call his students to look at it every morning. He did so, and the students smiled because they understood a simple thing: the road holds the city together. When the time came, the Queen sent a short message. She wrote that the Book of War was closed and that now it was time to keep the books of labor. She said that every day was important. This message was read in the square without loud words. People went about their business. The old man who brought the second half of the medallion died a few days later. Fatima and Hernando took him to the old cemetery and placed a stone there. A small sign, understandable only to them, was carved on the stone. It was a quiet conclusion to a long journey. A year passed. The city stood. Jugs were sold in the markets. Water ran in the irrigation ditches. The sign of the half moon on the wall of Fatima's house had not faded. Martin led caravans and guarded the fords. Lope moved another warehouse and found new workers among the former riflemen who had surrendered their hiding places in the early days. Captain Diego became a master of fortifications and learned to speak without harsh words. The treasurer left for the north, leaving behind clean books. Hernando continued to write short notes that made it clear who was doing what and why. He sometimes took out 2 connected medallions and remembered how the torches hissed one night and how the keys jingled in his palms. He did not admire this sound. He heard in it the steady sound of labor that keeps the city and its people together. Thus ended the story of the last key, and how a life that seemed alien and dangerous became understandable and shared. The ending was not a miracle. It was the result of the decisions that people made every day. Some kept their word, some brought jugs, some marked the fords, some knew how to see the way in simple signs. And if you ask where justice is, the answer is simple. It appears where everyone is responsible for their own actions and does not hide behind loud words. This conclusion does not require drums. It requires a smooth road, clean water, and hands that are not afraid of work. Another winter passed. The rains washed away the road to the northern fields, and the caravans began to be delayed. People were worried because there was less grain. Lope sent messengers to the western warehouses and ordered several carts of barley and oats to be brought over. He did not wait for permission because he understood the value of time. The treasurer, who had returned for a short time, noted the debt and the date in his notebooks. Hernando gathered the craftsmen and told them that the furnaces would operate at half power to save firewood. Fatima agreed and came up with a barter table where jugs were exchanged for grain and firewood at a reasonable rate. Meanwhile, Martin was checking the fords. He found a new crossing in the reeds and marked it with a pole. Once the carts were moved to the new path, the chariots stopped getting stuck. In the midst of the rains, a man in a dark cloak entered the city. He asked for a pass at the gate and said he had brought a letter from the Queen. The letter said that aid had been allocated to the southern cities and that the old roads to the monasteries should be cleared. The man reported that the railing on one of the bridges had collapsed and that a work crew was needed. Hernando sent Martin with the carpenters. They reinforced the piles, put in new boards, and returned by nightfall. At the market, people quietly thanked them, because now it was possible to cross that bridge in the dark without fear. The crops also had to be dealt with. Some gardens were in the shade of the walls, and grain did not grow well there. Fatima remembered how her father used to grow lentils and beans near the irrigation ditches during dry years. Hernando wrote down simple instructions and distributed them to the households. People sowed beans, and by autumn, the city had soft porridge that could be cooked on a single stove. These solutions did not seem grand, but they kept life going. In the spring, craftsmen came from a distant valley. They brought new molds for jugs and showed how to reinforce the edges so that they would not crack from the water pressure. Fatima carefully studied their technique and added another measurement to her table. Martin took the molds to neighboring villages and made sure that the road over the new ford could withstand the weight. Lope signed a supply contract in which all the numbers were written out in words, as required by the new rule, so that no one would confuse the columns. At this time, Captain Diego faced another challenge. The masonry on one of the towers had sagged. He gathered the masons and climbed up the wall. They dismantled the top layer and laid the stones again. The work was simple and hard. Diego realized that this work was good for his hands. He stopped writing complaints. He began to leave short notes in the margins of the drawings, clearly stating what had been done and on what day. The students read these notes and understood what to do. In the middle of summer, an old chest was brought to the city. It was found in the basement of a house that had been uninhabited for several years. The chest was sturdy, and there were traces of charcoal marks on the lid. Hernando ordered that it not be opened in the square. He took the chest to his workshop, which had stone floors, and carefully removed the lid. Inside were bundles of parchment, a couple of seals, and a bunch of marked keys. Some of the parchments contained plans for secret passages. Hernando realized that these papers could once again become a tool for those seeking a spark. He rewrote the important parts in his own words and burned the sheets with dangerous drawings. He handed the keys over to the treasurer. Fatima closed the window and said that now the city had fewer temptations for night people. On the same day, a strange package arrived. There were apples in the basket, and each one had a tiny mark carved into it. This mark was the same as the one that once led to the hiding place behind the wall. The treasurer ordered the apples to be burned so that there would be no arguing about the marks. Fatima said it was the right decision, because food should not be used for other people's games. Martin took the ashes beyond the irrigation ditch. People saw that the authorities were keeping calm and not making a spectacle out of a trifle. This line kept everything in order. In the fall, a delegation from neighboring places arrived in the city. They wanted to know how the handover of the keys had been carried out without bloodshed, and how ruin had been prevented. Hernando gathered the people in the square and explained in simple terms. He said that every promise had been recorded and that each promise was monitored by a specific person. He showed them Fatima's tables, Martin's route notes, Captain Diego's masonry, and Lopez's receipts. The guests looked closely and asked short questions. They left without loud praise, but the following year they sent word that things had quieted down for them too. By winter, the city was in turmoil again. Someone spread a rumor that old debts would be collected with an iron fist. People leafed through their records and lay awake at night. Lope came to the square and said through a messenger that there would be no rush and that each debt would be dealt with separately so that no one would be cornered. The treasurer confirmed his words in writing. Hernando added that a note would appear on the lists about a one-season reprieve for those involved in restoring the irrigation ditches. Fatima placed a jug of water on the table and said that without water there would be neither bread nor peace. Martin posted a notice on the gate, clearly explaining what to do. The rumors subsided. In the spring, talk turned to the roads again. The eastern trail had been washed away, and carts were getting stuck up to their axles. Martin suggested moving the road higher up onto a rocky ridge. Captain Diego supported him and assigned people to deepen the drainage ditch. The work was done in 3 days. Since then, the caravans have been running smoothly. Lope noticed that the cost of repairing axles had fallen and wrote it down in his book, because such small things save more gold than controversial speeches. By the middle of the year, a boy was born in the city. Fatima said she would name him after her brother. Hernando took out the medallion and looked at the joined halves again. He realized that the circle had closed not on the day the keys were handed over, but on the day people began to trust each other with their affairs. He wrote this down in a short sentence in his notebook. This entry did not make it into any chronicles, but the people around him felt its truth. At the end of summer, a traveler arrived from the northern roads. He brought several scrolls with patterns similar to those in Fatima's father's book. He said through the steward that he had seen similar symbols on jugs in distant places. Fatima showed him the workshop and gave him water. The traveler left one scroll as a gift and departed. This small thing became proof that the patterns and work went beyond campfires and tents. People rejoiced quietly because the joy of labor loves silence. At the end of this long journey, the Queen sent another message. She wrote that the books recorded that the keys had been handed over, the people were protected, and the roads were holding. She thanked those who had done their part. In response, the city sent a short note saying that the water was flowing smoothly, the stoves were burning quietly, the bread was being baked according to plan, and the children were running along the dry path. Martin left with this letter. He returned a few weeks later and said that the northern roads had also become quieter. Thus, the justice that many had sought for years was established. No one got everything they dreamed of, but everyone got their share of peace. And if you ask what was the final key, the answer is simple. The final key was the ability of people to keep their word, count their measure, and remember the sign that connects the shore and the home. The last few months were smooth and clear. The city woke up early, and at dawn you could hear shutters opening and someone's bare feet stepping on the stone. There was a bulletin board in the square where everyone could find something to do. There were notes about the day of cleaning the irrigation ditch, transporting firewood, sewing bags, and transporting clay. These small lines looked dry, but they were the foundation of everything. Fatima kept a list of students and noted who had learned to keep in shape and who was still breaking necks. Martin wrote short notes about the depth of the fords after each rain. Captain Diego walked around the walls every week and wrote down where to sew a new bracket, where to replace a stone, where to reinforce a step. Lope checked the warehouse, counted the sacks, recorded the movement of the carts, and every expense in words so that no one would argue about the numbers. Hernando bound the notebooks and signed the margins so that they could be read years later. Sometimes he went out onto the roof and looked at the valley. The wind stirred the banners, and it seemed to him that the city was breathing evenly, like a person after a long illness, when the fever subsides and strength returns. One evening, he placed the joined medallion on the table. He looked at the medallion calmly and put it in his wallet. The work continued, and the city breathed evenly, without unnecessary words.